Hi, it's Chris Leach here. For Control the Catastrophe Caesar, this time we're going to be looking at one of the three scenarios that's included in the book, the Battle of Hydaspes. This is, of course, fought between Alexander the Great's Macedonians versus an Indian army commanded by Porus. This isn't going to be a super detailed overview of the scenario. You can look at those details in the book, but I wanted to present the way I represent the armies and a turn-by-turn, brief overview of the action. So here we have the two armies based upon the scenario army lists. I want to stress these are not the standard army lists, these are scenario-driven army lists. And this is, of course, the deployment as recommended by the scenario. You do not have to deploy the armies in this way. You can use the scenario army lists and use a free deployment. It's entirely up to you. The Macedonian army is significantly smaller than the Indian army, but it has some advantages. It's a very high quality army with 4 tough heavy cavalry units, companions, 2 pike blocks, which are also tough with a CCV of 5. Even the standard pike blocks are a challenge for the Indian infantry. So this is a high quality force, but it is, as I say, outnumbered. And the threat with the outnumbering is the fact that it can, and as you'll see will be, outflanked by the Indian army. So for the Macedonian player, he has to think very carefully about how to leverage that quality and that striking power, particularly of his heavy cavalry. You'll notice that half the Macedonian heavy cavalry is positioned behind the battle line. Historically, there was some question as to where some of the heavy cavalry was actually located. There's no question that Alexander decided to use a striking force of cavalry on his right wing, where he placed himself, and he also put his horse archers well out on the wing to deal with some of the Indian mounted forces, especially the chariots, actually. But as I say, there's a question as to where some of that heavy cavalry was located, and instead of committing the player to having it all concentrated on the right or having it some of it on the left, where apparently it maybe started and moved during the course of the battle, I decided to allow the Macedonians, and you'll see the Indians as well, to have some of their heavy cavalry in a central location so the players can decide where they want to push that additional heavy cavalry. So this is less an interpretation than it is a sort of a pragmatic play option. So here's the Indian army in all its glory. I love the Indian army. It's colorful, it's diverse in terms of troop types. You know, for the period in question, you know, you've still got a significant chariot arm. The elephants, of course, are wonderful. I have loads of elephants, which I love to put on the table. And, you know, the infantry, heavy mixed units with bow and spear. In this particular interpretation, of course, there's some question as to sort of exactly how they may have been armed. You know, all of these elements make for a really interesting army. Now, in playing the sort of the standard pickup game armies based upon the army lists, I have to say the Indian army can actually have a tough time winning. And in this particular scenario, it's actually in a bit of a better position because it is larger than the Macedonian army. And I've had to modify some of the characteristics of the units to reflect what I think was the case in this actual battle. For whatever reason, Porus seemed to have relatively little confidence in his infantry arm and relied more on his elephants and his mounted units, particularly his cavalry, actually, which is often considered not so great in other rule sets, but seemed to perform actually, you know, really quite admirably in this battle. So there's a few tweaks that you can look up, obviously, in the scenario itself in the book. But again, a tough army on the day, and we'll see how it goes. So here are the armies once again deployed, ready for play. I just wanted to make mention of the fact that on my 6 by 12 foot table, I have this mat here which has a grid that is 12 boxes deep and 24 boxes long. Now this of course is a very large grid, and it really works with the basing of my models that are basically across the board 60 by 60 millimeter squares, with the exception of models like the chariots or elephants that require a somewhat larger or deeper stand, same frontage. I do have a mat that has a very small grid on it that I use on a 6 by 4 foot table with single stand units, and I have a mat that actually adheres more closely to the recommended size of grid, not necessarily box size, but just grid size, which has boxes that accommodate 3 stands wide by 3 stands deep, whereas the mat you can see in the image is really 2 by 2 of my particular bases. The point is that you can play this scenario or any other scenario of this game, of course, using any grid size as long as your models fit in there and they represent the armies that you're trying to represent. So anyway, let's get this game going. Each image that I'm going to show you represents the end of that particular turn. Both players rolled a d6, the Macedonians scored higher, and so have to start the game. This is the end of their turn, turn 1 effectively. And what we can see is that the Macedonians have decided to get their skirmishing troops, at least their bow-armed troops, into range, and immediately, of course, shot with them after the movement phase. The other thing that you can see is the Macedonian player has decided to quickly advance the right wing mounted arms. So a couple of units of companions with Alexander himself personally attached to one of the companion units. Of course, there's still a brigadier, a brigade general, attached to that brigade of heavy cavalry. The horse archers are well out on the right, and of course are going to try to get into range as quickly as possible to put as many hits on the Indian chariots or cavalry, whatever presents itself, as I say, as quickly as possible. So this is definitely a right hook that the Macedonian player is intending on doing. You'll notice that the reserve cavalry, to which the Macedonian player has attached a brigade general each, so it's really flexible. The Macedonian player has decided to push some of that cavalry to the left wing of the Macedonian army, and the other is moving to the right. This is a big decision because, of course, this divides the strength of that formation, and it may be a compromise decision. So here we have the Indian turn. This is their first turn, effectively turn 2 in the game. And it looks like everyone's kind of coming out for the party. One thing to note in this scenario is that the ground was apparently somewhat soft that day, affecting the performance of the chariots. And so for the scenario, I've reduced the movement rate, the movement allowance of the chariots to just 1 move action. So they're moving no faster than the heavy infantry. But the whole lot is moving forward, and the elephants particularly have darted forward, wanting to come to grips with the Macedonian main line as quickly as possible. Now, in order to get there, they do have to confront the Macedonian skirmish line of open order units. And if you'll note in the rules, elephants are a little vulnerable to skirmishing units, to open order or light units generally. They don't get shock and they don't get their order density advantage. But they're still a powerful unit, and if they win a round of melee, against these light units, those light units will automatically break. They do not have to take a catastrophe test. So this is actually a pretty big deal, and so we'll have to wait and see how those elephants fare against those open order Macedonian units. So here we have the end of the Macedonian turn, and again, nominally turn 3. And the Macedonians have committed themselves to those initial movements, namely the heavy cavalry and light cavalry right wing are advancing quite rapidly on the Indian lines that have more or less held their ground. You'll notice that the Indian player has decided to move their reserve cavalry towards that left wing, and they're leaving the chariots to deal with any threat from the Macedonian cavalry. So they're committing far greater strength to their left. The Macedonian open order units have not done particularly well. They've already lost one of their units in this round of melee, and the elephants were not forced to pursue, so they've held their position. They're kind of keeping their brigade together, which of course they have to do unless there's a pursuit. So the Macedonian turn is not terribly eventful. There's a little bit more melee happening between some of the open order units, the light units, but nothing too dramatic in this third turn. So here we are with the Indian turn again, and the advance continues. You'll notice on the sort of bottom right, Indian skirmishers, open order units have advanced into range and have decided to concentrate their shooting against the Macedonian heavy cavalry, and have really done some solid work against them, causing them to suffer enough hits to become shaken. And I have to say, this is actually one of the dangers with isolated cavalry units that allow enemy skirmishers to concentrate shooting at them. They are, of course, they're shallow units. They don't take many hits before they become shaken or even arrive at their catastrophe trigger. So you have to be really careful here and not ignore the power of skirmishers, especially with those shallow units. Now, fortunately for those Macedonian cavalry, they are tough, and so they will tend to pass catastrophe tests, but you don't want to play your game constantly having to pass catastrophe tests. So this is something to keep in mind. In the center, the elephants have successfully eliminated the Macedonian open order units, so luck again was on their side, and they're poised obviously to continue their advance against the Macedonian phalanx. The Indian heavy infantry similarly is continuing its advance. On the Indian left, the mounted units, the cavalry and chariots, have all engaged the enemy, and here again the Macedonians fall into some bad luck. The companion unit with Alexander attached is raised to legendary level, so they're throwing a lot of dice in melee. A base of 6 plus 2 for shock. They're throwing 8 dice against those really rather diminished Indian chariots. They should win, but lo and behold, in this turn of melee, they actually do win, but the chariots survive. They pass their catastrophe test. And so just things are not going the way of the Macedonians, and the Indians keep surging forward. This is a really, really important turn in the game, at least with hindsight. This is the Macedonian turn, again, effectively turn 5 in the game, and this is where things, as I say, fall apart on some level. The overall Macedonian plan is still continuing. They have decided, of course, already in a previous turn to advance their tough phalanx units forward, ideally in support of what they hoped would be a successful right hook with the cavalry. Unfortunately, in this turn, the Macedonians suffer the loss of Alexander the Great in melee. His cavalry unit was broken through a failed catastrophe test, and Alexander himself was killed. Now, I know that strictly speaking, this would probably mean game over and let's pack up our figures and say, well, historically, this would be the end. But I think actually Alexander, who of course was wounded many times, I think this Macedonian army probably would have fought on or had the wherewithal to fight on, given the complexity of their command and control structure and, frankly, the professionalism of this army. Would they have continued to campaign in India a little longer than they actually did? Probably not. But for the purposes of this game, the loss of Alexander and, of course, the companions to which he was attached represents 2 units broken as far as the defeat of the Macedonian army. This is a big deal. So again, here we have the end of the Indian turn, and you can see that the Indians in their movement phase plowed straight into the Macedonian phalanx with their elephants. And you can see the results of that. One of the Indian elephant units was actually broken, failed a catastrophe test in that first round of melee. And as a consequence, the Indian player had to decide where to put the brigade general. You can see the brigade generals, by the way, are the rather massive Indian elephant models with the umbrellas. And Porus is actually the one at the rear of the Indian infantry with the sort of fuchsia pink umbrella. But in the case of the elephant brigade, the sort of turquoise umbrella that you can see, well, the brigadier is moved over to the left and is leaving the Indian elephant unit on the right, isolated and out of command. But quite honestly, it's in melee, and if it should win, or, frankly, the battle will be over by the time this becomes a problem. So, a wise move, I suppose, to put the brigade general with the 2 units on the left. Now, the Indians are doing well and certainly exploiting the fact that they have basically won, or at least gotten the upper hand, in the left wing cavalry and mounted unit battle, with the chariots actually still holding on, at least one of those units. The other problem, the Macedonians just simply aren't putting many shooting hits from their horse archers onto the Indian cavalry. Now this is partly due to the fact that this cavalry is being driven back, and moving cavalry, including those that evade, just don't shoot as well. They don't throw as many dice because of modifiers. So this is a little bit of a problem. But dice luck is just not on the side of the Macedonians, and the Indians seem to be doing well. Even in places where the Indians have to roll for catastrophe, with the exception of the elephants, they seem to be passing. So the dice gods are on their side. Here we have the end of the Macedonian turn, number 7. And finally, the Macedonian cavalry on their left wing at the bottom of the image has engaged the Indian chariots. It should be a mismatched fight, given the fact that the chariots are brittle. They have a much lesser shock bonus of just 1 die as opposed to 2. But because of all the shooting losses that the cavalry suffered on their way into combat, the Macedonian cavalry are actually in a very vulnerable position. And they do hold on for this turn of melee, for sure, but their likelihood of success now, having not broken through that first chariot unit, is very slim, because you can guess what's going to happen in the Indian turn. The Indians are going to do a diagonal charge with their extra chariot unit with the brigadier attached down there with the yellow umbrella, the light chariot, and it's just going to go from bad to worse. So in this turn, we can see that the Indian infantry, they're the active side, are surging forward. to engage the pinned Macedonian phalanx. But we can also see a couple of other results that occurred during this turn. Down at the bottom of the image, we can see that the Indian chariots and the Macedonian cavalry actually fought themselves to a point where both had to take catastrophe tests, and both failed, actually. So that was kind of interesting. Basically, they just warred themselves to a point where they no longer represent functional units. And the same occurred actually on the Indian left, where their chariots and the Macedonian cavalry wore themselves to that point, and both failing their catastrophe tests. By the way, this is indicative once again of the poor dice rolling for the Macedonians, who have an advantage in these tests, given the fact that their combat and control value, their CCVs, are 5s. These are tough units, but they just keep failing. You can see that on the left side, from an Indian perspective of the Macedonian phalanx, an Indian elephant unit has done a diagonal charge. Once again, the Macedonian pike block is able to turn to face because they're not already pinned in melee, but will also suffer that -2 for being unformed. So it's a pretty desperate situation for the Macedonians. It's just looking worse and worse. Now, that said, I have to stress that you'll notice that the Indian Elephant Brigade has lost 2 of its units. It's lost 2 chariot units. They are suffering losses, but it's just not looking good for the Macedonians. In this turn, the Macedonians are really just holding on. They don't have many units to move. Most of their units are engaged or poised to be engaged. They have brought in their last pike block on the right. A little difficult to see in these images, I apologize, since it favors the sort of the bottom of the frame. But the Macedonian phalanx units on the right have done diagonal charges against the Indian infantry, or faced diagonal charges, and there was really no choice. They had to confront these Indian infantry, but frankly, losing whatever benefit they had for being these high quality, tough phalanx units, being unformed, it just robs them of that edge that they should normally have. So again, not looking good for the Macedonians. So here we are at the end of that next Indian turn, and things are again looking bad for the Macedonians. The Indian infantry is almost in contact with them along that sort of center of the Macedonian line. And this is just going to be a disaster when the Indian infantry are able to flank, for example, that Macedonian pike unit that's facing the elephants. One thing to note is that you might have noticed in the previous slide that the Macedonians were fighting an Indian elephant unit, and there's that kind of gap you can see there that no longer has the Indian elephants. Well, those Indian elephants actually broke and fled through the Indian infantry that's sort of held back there with the brigade general elephant sitting next to them. Now, that is a flight path catastrophe test, and it carries a -1 to the unit CCV for the fact that it's elephants that are passing through them. But once again, just amazingly, the Indian player, who also benefits from the fact that that unit is steady, managed to hold on, managed to pass that test. It was 50-50. And once again, they pass. So everything seems to be going the way of the Indians in this particular game. The Macedonian cavalry on the right wing are engaged against the Indian cavalry. Once again, this should be an advantaged fight to the Macedonians. The Indian cavalry do not have shock. The Macedonians normally do, although they are unformed, and so once again suffer from the fact that they lose a number of their advantages. So it's just been tough from the get-go. The Macedonians are again in a situation where the vast majority of their units are engaged. There's really not many choices they had. The one thing that they did do was that they advanced the pike unit forward into the gap in the Indian line, and this was done purely to avoid having the Indian player do a diagonal charge against that pike unit using the right-hand infantry unit in the Indian turn. This was a little tactical ploy, just buy the Macedonians a little bit of time, but frankly, it's all going downhill. So here we are, 12th turn of the game. It's the Macedonian active turn, but really the Macedonians have virtually nothing to move, and so nor shoot for that matter, and so it more or less just went straight to the melee phase. And in the melee phase, the Macedonians lost their right wing cavalry unit. This, of course, actually sealed their fate. The game more or less ended at that point because the Macedonians had, at that stage, lost both 4 massed units, heavy units, and also Alexander the Great. That equates to the 5 that would determine their defeat. But in this turn, they also lost one of their phalanx units. So it's a sound Indian victory. I should point out that it was actually still fairly tough to achieve this victory in spite of the many advantages that ultimately the Indians enjoyed. So here we have the final tally. The Indians lost 6 heavy units broken. This was a combination of chariots and elephants. Now the scenario defines defeat for the Indians in 2 ways. If the Indians had lost all their elephants and all their cavalry, which on the day seemed to be Porus's main elements of attack, they would have lost. Alternatively, if they didn't lose all their elephants and cavalry, it would be a combination of 10 heavy units of any type, including chariots and heavy infantry. Well, they lost 6. So quite a significant loss of units, but nowhere near that break point of 10. The Macedonians, of course, did achieve that point, that threshold of losses, and the fact that Alexander himself was killed was certainly a blow, and historically would have been devastating, of course. So I hope you enjoyed this brief overview of the first of 3 scenarios in the book. And now I just want to show a quick kind of rapid fire presentation of those images again to kind of give you a sense of the movements across the field in a larger image. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks very much for watching this Control the Catastrophe presentation.